Some of you may not be familiar with Switch, but we have a few event groups across the country that work to bring together energy communities and colleagues to network and share ideas on the energy transition. While we usually have these events in person, we, like many others, have had to shift in times of COVID. While we haven't shifted, however, is our goal of bringing an engaging, interesting, and entertaining event to the energy community. To keep the conversation rolling in the chat box, we would all also like you to submit what your definition of resilience is. Resilience is the topic of the conversation tonight. And as you've seen in the last year, we have had two once-in-a-100-year climate events and two very energy ecosystems, California and Texas, that have led to long-term blackouts. How the grid has traditionally delivered safe, affordable, and reliable energy is struggling in the face of increasing natural disaster brought about by climate change. The creation of a new, smart, resilient, and affordable grid is happening right now and is in our hands. And we have three expert panelists tonight who are speaking to the varying visions of this particular future. Again, I would like to remind everyone to keep their video and microphone off throughout the panel discussion and to submit comments and questions in the chat box. We are so excited that the event is finally here and are so grateful to our incredible panel that has donated their time to be here with us tonight. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback as well, the audience, in the virtual networking event afterwards, where we will also be giving away an Amazon Echo 5. I will be sharing a link to that platform after the conversation tonight. And with that, I'll hand it off to our fantastic moderator, Josh Radoff, who, congratulations, has just accepted two positions as both a zero carbon cities advisor at ICLEI and a renewable and sustainable energy specialization lead at CU. I'll let you take it from here, Josh. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Samantha. Okay, hi everybody. I guess for the Switch faithful out there who look forward to this event each year, welcome back. If there are any first timers out there, maybe made possible by the fact that we're virtual, welcome to you. I'm glad that we are continuing the Switch tradition today. You know, it's not maybe the normal drunken bacchanal that you're used to, where you get to roast and potentially cheer on your colleagues in person. But for all I know, you're all doing that right now in some sort of vaccinated Switch watch party. So I'm going to assume that that's the case. Also, you know, the virtual format, even if you maybe are tired of virtual formats, you know, it still does introduce the strong possibility that my 4-year-old will burst in the room in hysterics that I destroyed his art project, which is ridiculous because I didn't. I love this event because it's unapologetic about saying, yes, this is what energy industry people do for fun. We're going to talk about grid resilience, whether we have a drink in our hand or without. So here we go. One of the reasons I'm particularly excited about this topic is the fact that there's a lot of things converging or happening right now out in the world that make this particularly timely. I'll list three that I think will sort of like maybe be the sort of themes for this conversation. The first is that we seem generally resolved about getting to 100% decarbonized grid in short order. And whether we're going to argue whether that's 2030 or 2040 or 2050. I don't know if people saw the LBNL study that was recently released that said we were about 42% from our peak in 2005, and that the slope of that reduction is getting steeper in a good way. The Energy Gang talked about that in a recent podcast. And I was sort of doing some research, and there are at least 8 states that have legally binding 100% renewables targets by 2050 at least, and several utilities with similar mandates representing about 50% of all electricity sales in the country. So a strong push for that. What's more, the Biden administration will hopefully pass the Clean Energy Standard, which many of you have probably seen, requiring 80% reduction by 2030 and 100% by 2035, which would be amazing. Second point, part of the overall sort of like strategy is the electrify everything component, whether it's buildings or vehicles, and anything else that formerly combusted fossil fuels. And then the third thing is that the world is sometimes in a very literal sense, crumbling around us. I saw some version of a quote that said, yeah, the reason we need a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package right now is because we've been busy not investing in anything for decades. And so we need to do some catch up. As Sam mentioned at the outset, the California and Texas grid disasters are some of the biggest and most recent examples of this challenge, at least on the energy side, although people tracking the real-time event of the gasoline pipeline cybersecurity on the East Coast, the need for large-scale strategic investment and changing maybe the way we think about resilience and infrastructure is all around us. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I'll start by introducing our three panelists, and then we'll start the conversation. So first, Robin Lunt. Hi, Robin. You want to wave hello? Okay. Robin is the Chief Strategy Officer at Guzman Energy. Guzman and is probably many more things in this, but at least is a wholesale electricity supplier serving Western state rural co-ops and munis. Robin previously served as a general counsel of Guzman and in senior roles with FERC and NARUC, and brings 8 years of DC policy cred, and is also a member of the Colorado, Washington, DC, and California bars because, you know, it's good to have options. Brian Hannigan is hello, Brian, is the president and CEO of Holy Cross Energy, a non-for-profit member-owned electric cooperative utility providing electricity and energy products and services to more than 45,000 customers in Western Colorado with their headquarters in Glenwood Springs. Notably, Holy Cross has established a plan to obtain 100% renewables and clean energy for its members by 2030. Prior to joining Holy Cross, Brian was the associate lab director at NREL, which is an org that some of you are probably aware of because they've done switch presentations in the past, where he co-founded the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Modernization Initiative and started up the Energy Systems Integration Facility, ESIF. And then lastly, Chris Worley. Hello, Chris. Is with Sunrun. Chris is the director of public policy with Sunrun, which is the US's largest residential solar installer. I think that's been true for at least a couple of years running. And a company increasingly providing solar and batteries and grid services solutions. Chris oversees policy and government affairs in the Mountain West region. Prior to joining Sunrun, Chris was director of rate design for Vivint Solar, working on rate cases and value of solar regulatory proceedings throughout the country. Chris also worked on energy policy at Colorado Energy Office, for those of you local here, and is no doubt partially responsible for the state's progressive leadership on a lot of great renewable energy issues. So welcome, all of you. Let's get into the first question. The first question is for Chris. Is for Brian. I wrote Chris, but I meant Brian. You know, we're talking resilience. In the Mountain West, what problems are we really trying to solve? Do we have congestion and capacity issues? Or are we just looking at wildfire? And you know, more importantly, like, how does a company like Holy Cross think about resilience? And is it different to you than the idea of reliability? Let's start there.
Yeah, Joshua, thanks. That's a great place to start. And hello, switchers. So glad to be with you. I would be engaging in the drunken bacchanal, but we have a drug-free workplace here at Holy Cross. As you can see, this is not a backdrop. This is actually live video from Glenwood Springs. Everybody says, how'd you get those cars to move? What do I think about reliability and resilience? Well, you know, as Joshua mentioned in the open, I've had a lot of time to think about this in context of DOE and the Grid Modernization Initiative and the federal government's view of resilience of energy systems, and then living the dream here at Holy Cross in the utility space. And I guess the way that I would put it is resilience is, can you take a punch? Okay, and that punch could come from any source. It could come from a cyber attack, like with the Colonial Pipeline. It could come from a wildfire, like has happened to the Holy Cross system 2 out of the last 3 years. It could come from a variety of hazards, to use the DOE vernacular. And so to me, that's different than reliability, which is, can you stay up when not punched, right? Do you fall down under normal circumstances by yourself? And so when you talk about capacity and the sort of blue sky services that an electric grid provides, to me, those are issues of reliability. Is there reliable service? Can I count on it to stay on under normal operating conditions? Resilience kicks in when things are decidedly not normal, right? When there is an equipment failure, when there is a massive disturbance to the system, when you have some external event that's driving you. And to me, that is the new, what are we solving for, that we have to take into account when we're planning and we're operating, not just electric grids, but energy systems. It's really important because as we try to decarbonize our entire economy, we have to recognize that something that might be a disturbance outside of the electric sector comes home to affect the grid. A massive growth in electric vehicles, or even something as simple as a consumer that we serve plugging a Tesla into a transformer that's not been sized correctly for that use because it was put there 30 years ago when EVs weren't a thing. So I think resilience is kind of the new buzzword, but I don't want us to confound that with reliability because we really are trying to solve for both simultaneously. They're very different things.
So for and just following on up on that, for a utility that is majority or entirely a distribution utility, right? Holy Cross doesn't own its own generation for the most part.
For the most part.
Yeah. Is resilience for you then a matter of making sure that the poles, remain standing, or is it about like your long-term or short-term energy contracts and the type of supply that you're contracted with?
It's all the above. It's having the resource adequacy to make sure that we can keep the lights on in any event. I think Texas put a spotlight on why that's an important aspect of resilience of electric service, making sure that the physical infrastructure is resilient to impacts, people shooting at things falling down, external factors, polar vortices, as was suggested in the chat. But I also think that resilience is about having multiple options and multiple plans. What happens? How do you maintain electric service when you don't have the grid? How do you maintain electric service in a mountain valley where you have one way in and one way out to connect to the rest of the outside world? How do you maintain electric service that is increasingly reliant on communications when the communications piece might fail? What's your backup there? So I think there are a lot of different dimensions to resilience that don't lend itself to an easy definition, which is probably why there are as many definitions as there are attendees tonight. Yeah,
cool. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Robin, you all, I think, service Holy Cross. And in general, I think Guzman as a wholesale supplier has a certain kind of like mystique to it because we're in the deregulated West here. So could you first just talk a little bit about how Guzman works and how you support customers both with the renewable transition and with resilience? And I'm kind of curious, like how are the nature of your contracts evolving to reflect some of the needs that Brian was talking about? And if you have specific examples of how you're working with Holy Cross, that'd be great to hear as well.
Great. I feel like highly underqualified for this panel because both of my co-panelists have PhDs. So maybe that's the weight of the multiple bars that I have to like try and counterbalance that with. But thanks so much for inviting me. So Guzman is a wholesale power supplier, and there's so many things to talk about here. The system, the electric system, you sort of traditionally you think of it as generation, transmission, distribution, and retail customers, right? And how does all of that system fit together? And especially as the like one-way flow of electricity is shifting, and how does that work together? So Guzman tends to be on the G side of the equation, right? So we're getting electrons across the transmission lines to Holy Cross, DMEA, Kit Carson, other co-ops and munis in the Mountain West, and also with prospective clients in organized markets. So that's kind of the way that our contracts operate, and they're most of the time fixed prices. So when there's variability in prices, we are the ones that absorb that variability, and our customers do not. So there's sort of three components of power supply that we like to think of: capacity, which is the ability to produce electrons when you need to; energy, the electrons themselves; and then the renewable attributes, and all of those balanced against price and preference of customers. So figuring that out. And then how does this idea of resilience fit within that metric? I thought Brian's comments were really insightful and accurate, right? It's kind of a new construct, and it's hard to pin down. We think about reliability of planning for system normal. And as somebody said in the chat, like, let's stop calling these 100-year storms 100-year storms when they happen every year, it seems like. So what is new normal? And then how do you address, N-1, normal -1? So a situation, a transmission line goes down, a big generator goes down. Everything should be fine in that situation. What happened in Texas was kind of like N-9, right? You had a breakdown of weatherization, you had a breakdown of gas and electric interdependency. You have a system that is by design to address their regulatory challenges, not well interconnected with the rest of the country. So that adds complexity. And I think that, we play on the G side of the equation. I think resilience is a system-wide issue. So while we have the obligation to make sure that we have reliability attributes checked, so capacity and energy available to supply our loads, that resilient component is a system question and something that nobody is in alone, right? We all have to work together to solve that.
So, I mean, I don't know if others are sort of surprised to hear, again, like a regulated environment talking about capacity contracts and energy contracts. But I mean, do you sort of function like a mini PJM out here for the munis and co-ops, or how do you sort of like distinguish what you're doing relative to what might happen in an ISO or a wholesale market?
Yeah, I think you'd be surprised. Like, you think that sort of traditional markets like the Mountain West are only vertically integrated utilities or G&Ts, but they're not. There's a ton of trading that happens in these areas. And I think one of your questions is like, how does somebody become a wholesale power provider? And, wholesale power is regulated by FERC. So when you sell to somebody who's going to sell to somebody else, that's regulated by FERC. And there are regulations becoming a market-based rate authorized seller. So the issue of regulation at the wholesale level is about competition, right? If you don't have competition, you could manipulate the market. So they look at it from an economic perspective. Do you control upstream or downstream components that would allow you to price gouge, or do you control too much of the market of the generation that would allow you to price gouge? And if not, then you can sell power at market-based rates, which is whatever two parties will buy and sell for. And that's true throughout the country, no matter where the market is. So no, like, we're not a PJM, we're not a clearinghouse. Things in the West happen bilaterally through transactions.
Mm-hmm.
But the important thing is that, in the 90s, FERC said, okay, we need open access to the transmission system because generation should be competitive. And I think that as I reflect on a lot of these pieces of resilience, there's an investment required for that, right? So the more we can take the price declines on the, renewables and even natural gas on the generation side, and then transition those investments into the other infrastructure areas, we're going to be better off and more resilient as a system. So I kind of answered a whole bunch of your questions.
Well, no, hold there, because I want to come back to that question about how we value resilience, because I think that's another topic I want to speak to. Chris, I presumably all this dysfunction in the grid is just like the easiest sort of opportunity for a company that's selling solar and distributed generation. Can you talk a little bit about how Sunrun is evolving to sort of meet this opportunity? Is it just like answering the phone and sort of doing more installations? Is it sort of changing your pitch or your business model? What do you see as the sort of like most exciting kind of growth opportunities and way that you can evolve to meet this the evolving needs here?
Yeah. Thanks to you and all the switchers for being here today. That's a great question. Like you mentioned at the top, Sunrun we're strictly a residential solar installer, and so our business model is really meeting with homeowners, people who are interested in investing in their home, adding solar panels, adding battery storage for backup or for addressing time of use arbitrage. And these people, they want a clean energy option. They want energy bill savings, and that's really what they're interested in. And that's something that we, as a large national solar installer, we can provide that for them at a pretty good cost. We can make it a pretty good deal. And so our focus, traditionally, or the solar industry, the distributed solar industry, our market has really been focused on these customers. But over the last 5, 6, 7 years, as batteries have been come down in price, we've been able to deploy those. We've been able to get other sorts of customers, utilities, in some cases, ISOs, and we're able to provide other sorts of services to those customers. And we think we can make it a win-win-win for everybody involved, for us, for the customer who is hosting the solar and energy storage, as well as the utility. We can provide services to them that benefits everybody.
So is Sunrun marketing itself as an aggregator, or is it an aggregator right now with certain utilities in certain regions?
Yes, Sunrun is an aggregator. We provide solar and solar plus storage as a service, an energy service to our customers, but also to utilities. And so we are in 2019, we bid into New England ISO and into the capacity markets, and we won a 20 megawatt bid for behind the meter resources starting in 2022. So we are aggregating a bunch of our customers on the distribution system. We are using our software to network all of those resources, and we are creating a virtual power plant, or what's called a virtual power plant. Essentially, it's like traditional utility demand response programs. They made everybody turn off the power at certain times. Well, with battery storage, you can really control and you can dispatch power instead of just cutting off power. And so we think it's an amazing technology, and the more we can bid this into competitive markets, the more that we can provide this service to utilities. What we think everybody really benefits from this.
Yeah, sure. So on the virtual power plant side, which is, when I sort of first discovered this term, like a light bulb went off, like, oh, of course. And then in the blackouts in California last summer, I think there was a lot of discussion that ISO wasn't able to access some of these resources that may exist out there. Are you still seeing market barriers in a lot of these markets? And then I guess as a corollary to that question, are you seeing either utilities or grid operators issuing resilience programs that are specific to that, like valuing resilient services?
Yeah, and maybe let me start with that one. I think that question is a little more straightforward. There are several utilities around the country, I would say largely in the Northeast, that have launched what they call bring your own device programs, where you're a homeowner and you've got your solar, you've got a battery. You can apply to participate in this program. You maybe get an upfront rebates. You get ongoing rebates or incentives the longer you participate in the program. So these bring your own device programs are starting to pick up around the country. And so in that case, we as Sunrun, the installer, we would help install the solar and the battery. We would not function as an aggregator in that case, but we're happy to do that because it's a win for everybody involved. In terms of, I think, to your first question about barriers to aggregation and those sorts of programs related to that, yeah, you're absolutely right. A utility, you have to develop a relationship with the utility. They have to want to offer some sort of program. They have to select you as the vendor. In 2019 in Hawaii, we won a contract with Hawaiian Electric for about 1,000 existing and new homes with batteries, solar and batteries, or other cases where I would say in California, the community choice aggregators have been very friendly and very interested in figuring out how they can do virtual power plants. In Oakland, we are, just this last year, we announced a contract for a virtual power plant on 500 low-income units, and it's going to help them retire a peaking plant. So where utilities are really interested in this, where there are where the ISO is interested, where they are offering, where they allow aggregators to play in that market, that's great. But it's very few and far between, I would say.
Yeah. So I guess for Brian or Robin, back to this question about valuing resilience. One thing we're looking to is for markets to sort of create opportunities for aggregators in virtual power plants, like Chris is talking about. From your perspective, Brian, I guess I'll start with you. How would a utility like Holy Cross go about valuing resilience and incorporating into its planning in a way that maybe sort of not the same way that you were doing that, say, 10 years ago?
Well, I want to separate the question of virtual power plants and distributed energy resources from the resilience piece, because resilience is one of many value streams that a distributed resource, a behind the meter asset, can provide. And I think it's important that if we're going to accelerate the adoption of distributed energy resources on any utility system, we figure out a way to bundle all of those value streams together for the consumer in a way that makes it really easy for that consumer to say yes. And that means, as Chris was pointing out, a partnership between the device provider, the utility provider, the consumer itself, that factors in not the price for resilience, but a price for resilience. For example, we have a partnership with Chris's co-competitor, and I hope maybe we'll extend it to Sunrun here shortly. But we have a program called Power Plus, where we're offering, for those that don't want to bring their own device, we're offering to provide the devices for them to actually finance those through an on-bill payment. So there's no money down, 0% interest financing. We're basically stacking all the values for the consumer so that they don't have to think about it. They don't have to think about, how do I monetize that battery to help Holy Cross avoid investing in a bigger transformer? How do I value resilience? I just have it by virtue of being in this program. And if it's what I'm willing to pay for, as long as alongside all of these other values that Holy Cross is factoring into this in their relationship with me, if I'm willing to pay the $30 a month to have a couple of batteries on my garage wall or in my basement, and I get resilience too, well, that's just a sweetener. That just adds to it. So I think it's going to be a fool's errand, to be honest, if we try to chase a value of resilience that has a locational marginal value like the price of power supply in a market, because it means different things to different people, and it's very situationally dependent. The folks in Texas would have given anything. They would have paid any price for resilience at a certain point over the Valentine's Day weekend. Right now, probably not so much, right? Same devices, same system. So to me, resilience is one of those value stacks or one of those values in the stack that you bundle together, whether you're a Sunrun or a Guzman or a Holy Cross or anybody else in this market.
But ultimately, you need to structure a program, right? And it sounds like the way that you're structuring programs might be through a combination of a rate. And I don't know if you're doing sort of time of use.
It's a rate. It's a consumer program that has a rate offering bundled into it, along with a bill credit for the ability to use that storage device on the blue sky days to help us meet some of our market needs, to manage oversupply of renewables, or to help fill in if we don't want to go to the market and buy power or buy capacity from our other supplier, public service company, Colorado, Xcel Energy. If we can get it from a distributed resource at less than a cost that we can get from the market, that's better for us as a business. That's better for us as a consumer. Remind you, as a cooperative, we're not in this to make profit. You introduced a not-for-profit cooperative. So our owners are the people that we serve. They have a vested interest in making sure that we keep our costs low. So energy efficiency, demand side management, distributed resources, if those can provide value at a lower cost than the other options, we're going to bring them into our portfolio. And I guess the last thing I'll say, Joshua, is that as anybody who studied the decarbonization of the electric grid knows, you can only add so many big blocks of power supply from the bulk power system before you start running up against a limit where you actually need not a big chainsaw, but a scalpel to kind of chip away at your net load. And these distributed resources are the perfect tool for the job. And so as we get to 80, 85, 90% renewables on our journey to 100, we're going to be calling more and more on distributed resources and less on the grid.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just like you're describing these programs, and they sound to me like a lot of the ways that some of these kind of big, kind of clunky industrial type programs would have worked in the past. You know, DR programs, you're just able to sort of bring it down and spread it out to a much higher volume of participants, and at the same time, I assume, kind of engage your customer base, or owner base.
The digital grid, the digitalization, the smart devices, the ability to manage and control, to have operating systems that allow us to orchestrate a number of devices across a wide geographic area, to be able to do that on the supply side with smart inverters attached to solar and to batteries that are providing power supply, but also being able to modulate demand and actually pay people for the privilege of doing so. I mean, that's what makes this work in a way that maybe those old load control programs of a couple decades ago couldn't.
Right. Robin, do you see best practices out in the regions that you work in that are doing like interesting or good work in terms of structuring these programs to essentially bring about a lot of the sort of elements that Brian's talking about?
You know, I think Holy Cross is leading in this area, really. And I think to your question about valuing resilience, it's an expectation, right? Like customers aren't saying, oh, I'm going to pay a little bit more for resilience. So it's our job as suppliers to figure out how to integrate all of these new components, right? And I think your analogy about like old school demand response really fit when an old school system of these really big base load power units and then really big industrial customers. And now we're dealing with distributed technology, distributed use vehicles that may be charging wherever these people are going to be, you know. So we need to have this overlay of communications and control with somebody who they trust, right? Like your utility, to be able to maximize that value and make sure that, I think there's two components of it. One is ensure that the grid doesn't get out of balance, right? And the other is make sure that you monetize the assets that exist. You know, in our family, which is more this area than our business, we put solar panels on our roof and we have a smart meter. But literally when we moved in, we were going to put electric heating in the basement. And my husband's like, I can't even tell what we're using power for, right? And he bought some device off of Amazon and put it in. And I was like, we have a smart meter. This should give us information. But it didn't. So we're like, I think we're still on that bleeding edge of figuring out that how to take data and make it information that is actionable for consumers and, you know, distribution utilities to make choices about, okay, am I going to buy a megawatt from this community off of this substation, or am I going to build a new substation? Am I going to buy power from Guzman, or am I going to put in a distributed, you know, solar system here? And it's all math at the end of the day, but that math also has to factor in the way that the systems work and what options you have when it's not working the way that you're expecting it to.
Right. And ultimately, it's not, as Brian said, just locational marginal pricing. But it's, I don't know if anyone's like figured that out yet as like a perfect structure for like long-term capacity, you know, renewables and sort of addressing all these things on a real-time basis. I'm going to start looking at some of the questions that have been coming in from although Brian, I think you may be answering some real time. So if we've covered these.
There's more than we're going to be able to answer in person. So
I know it's good. If something's been covered, let me know. But there's a couple of questions around like what is a modernized smart grid enable us? So one question is, what are the prospects for a modernized smart grid that gives us price signals that allow us to buy and sell based on these signals? And, you know, my read on that is like, and I don't know about smart grid, you guys probably have a perspective on what smart grid means or what it could mean, but there are some markets that have price signals that are enabled to essentially enable certain kind of outcomes. And then there are regulated markets in which there are fewer for consumers, but is there something about like a modernized smart grid that sort of changes the way we think about this? And that's open to anyone.
I guess I'll just point out that price signals work except when the market is broken. And the market is typically broken when resilience needs are at their highest.
So are you saying like wink, wink, Texas? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, wink, wink, Texas. But I'm also thinking about our service territory that, basically has 3 branches. And if any one of those branches gets severed from the other because there's a wildfire going on in the middle of it and the transmission lines are down, the piece that's on the other side of the wildfire from the rest of the world isn't going to participate in the market. Now, there are possible constructs where that piece could self-organize and either through control signals or price signals kind of go with what it's got there. But that only works if you have distributed resources, both power supply and demand, as well as storage. If you've got enough resources in that little fragment to allow it to basically self-heal and autonomously operate. To me, when you're thinking about resilience, you're not really thinking about markets, because a lot of the concern that you have in resilience is just, can I get the lights on, period.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wouldn't look to markets as being the panacea for resilience. I think for creating a 100% renewables, reliable power system, well, now we're talking, and I think Chris probably has a thing or two to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think we're seeing a lot of utilities that are interested in time of use rates to better align customer usage during certain times of the day with whatever the system price is. Xcel Energy here in Colorado, they're going to, over the next few years, they're going to be moving all of their residential customers onto time of use. Although, from my understanding, there's an opt-out option, and I think that's a good first step to try and get to a more sophisticated grid. Clearly there are times of the day, there are times of the year when electricity energy is more expensive, and providing a signal to customers is a good thing. It gets customers to conserve during those times. They can shift load. For some customers who are able to, if they install a battery, they're able to automate that, and they can arbitrage, or they can shift their load much easier. But not all customers are going to be able to do that, and so I think we need to be real careful about that sort of approach, because those with the least means may end up being harmed by those sorts of changes. And so I think it's probably a good thing that in Excel's case they do have an opt-out. If customers are so interested.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple things there, but I wanted to essentially go to another question that came in about the trade-offs and optimization of regional transmission and distributed resources. How do we find the optimal mix of bigger transmission lines versus distributed solar and storage? And I guess maybe the way I would sort of like paraphrase that is like, are we just fighting against the fact that we haven't invested in national grid? And if we had more regional transmission, would that make these sort of challenges that we're talking about for resilience at the distribution level a lot easier? And would we need to sort of work so hard and so creatively with these solutions that we've been talking about? Robin, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I would just say you need both, right? We need wind from Western Colorado, or from Eastern Colorado going to Western Colorado, and we need battery systems in Glenwood Springs that turn on and can balance the grid when there's a fire that cuts them off from that other part of the world, right? My first experience and exposure to electric infrastructure was my mom fighting a high voltage transmission line that was going to go in our backyard. So there's always going to be resistance to that. Transmission is hard. And there's a question in here about, Biden's plan to create an agency in DOE to address that. And I think Brian answered it exactly right. Like, the states still have jurisdiction, and that's a very local fight. I just think that we need both, right? You have to have information and intelligence on both throughout the system. So like we started saying, it's generation, transmission, distribution, customers, and that used to go one way. And now, and transmission helps that generation get to customers, but it has to go both directions, and flow that way. So there's just not a silver bullet to any of these, but there's also some really tremendous opportunities in all of those little pieces that, Brian, I think you called a scalpel, right? Instead of a hatchet, to solve these problems. And especially when we talk resilience, we need somebody who can take that scalpel in and solve those problems.
And Joshua, I think it's really important to understand that transmission is only useful if I'm connected to it. If there has been a cyber intrusion at a substation between me and the bulk power system, transmission is of no use to me whatsoever from a resilience standpoint.
That was another question that came in. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Brian.
So the point I'm making is, if you're designing for resilience, you're going to design necessarily local. You're going to have your generation, your supply as near to your demand as possible, if you're designing with resilience in mind. But if you're trying to balance resilience and cost and reliability and environmental, what Robin is saying is absolutely right. You need to have multiple resources with some level of kind of interaction and interplay, so that you're never caught short without an option. Because the nightmares that I have as a utility CEO is, number one, somebody gets killed on the job. God forbid it should ever happen, right? Number two, someone gets thrown in jail as a result of being on the job, which God forbid it should ever happen. But right after that, the third, and the thing that I probably worry the most about, is people go without power for a long period of time. That is a bad time to be a utility CEO. And that's the very nature of the resilience challenge. So you want multiple options to keep that from happening.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I mean, I think just the reason we sort of came to distributed generation in the first place was because of that, right? It enables this sort of web architecture as opposed to reliance on a single central station or central transmission type of architecture. You guys each, I think, have touched on this question in the last round of equity in one form or another, whether it's in terms of, being able to sort of like, create either new rates or opt-out rates, or provide access to some of these distributed resources and batteries and so forth. And, I think both for Chris and for Brian, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this. But, Brian, your customers are your owners. And so my guess is that sort of changes the way that you look at this, but do you explicitly take an equity lens in structuring your programs?
We do, Joshua, but it's not enough. And I think the events of the last couple of years have really opened our eyes to the opportunities that we have to make sure that everyone has equitable access to the clean energy transition. And it's as simple as thinking about those that desire distributed energy resources, but don't have the financial wherewithal to pay the upfront cost so that they can take advantage of the tax credit. And I know Chris and Sunrun have done some really innovative work in this, which they'll hit on in a moment. It's also, for us as a utility, it's really simple to think of, providing access to electricity in a way that's not financially burdensome, that doesn't raise the energy burden beyond where it should be for the most vulnerable members of our society, the ones that are the lower moderate income, the ones that are the service economy workers on whom the big Vail and Aspen ski resorts that we serve, the temporary and the seasonal workers, the folks that are just trying to get by. So one of the best things that we can do for equity is, frankly, to keep our overall costs low, to run a tight and efficient ship, and to look for opportunities to partner with a Sunrun or a Guzman anytime that there could be value that gets created that we can then pass on to our members. And so providing that access and giving people options, making sure that we're not penalizing those that want resilience with higher costs while still being fair and equitable and not shifting those burdens onto others. That's kind of the balancing act that you do anytime you mess with your rates, your tariffs, your programs, whether you're regulated at the PUC or you're regulated by a co-op board like we are.
Mm-hmm. Chris, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I agree with just about everything Brian said right there. I think when we think about solar, when we think about rooftop solar, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when the industry was really first getting underway, you know, the first adopters, early adopters were relatively wealthy. They were able to pay the upfront cost, the $25,000 or $30,000. And, you know, over the last decade, 12 years, different financing options have made it, have brought down the income qualifications, quite frankly. And, you know, companies like Sunrun who offer leases, PPAs, you know, in many cases, you can get a lease or a PPA with no money upfront or really low money upfront. And that really allows people of modest incomes to be able to have bill savings on day one. You know, anecdotally, we have looked at certain markets and certain utilities and see a lot of uptake from sort of moderate income households with our lease products. But to Brian's point, it's really not enough. We are not doing enough to really reach those lower income qualified folks. Sunrun, we have a corporate impact goal of 500 megawatts of income qualified solar by the year 2030. And so we've had success in California. There's the SOMA program, which is for solar on multifamily buildings. And, you know, we're looking to figure out where we can do that, where we can work with multifamily building owners, the utilities, to try and get through a lot of the barriers and the hurdles to make these projects happen. And I'm hopeful that going forward, more and more effort, and we'll have more, we as an industry will have more and more success in that area.
Do we need to change the sort of federal policies? I think someone mentioned the way that ITC and tax credits are structured with that. Is that, I assume that's not something you'd want to see, because that's the sort of main like incentive driver, but is there a reform out there that you'd advocate for?
You know, at the federal level, I don't know that changing the ITC would necessarily be helpful, or I think as an industry, we're pushing to extend the federal ITC. And so we're all on board for that. You know, in terms of like, you know, local policies, you know, ensuring, you know, strong net energy metering policies, ensuring, you know, figuring out, there's a lot of sort of like local and utility and state level restrictions on how you can deal with multifamily buildings and virtual net metering. And so, you know, I think for Sunrun and for a lot of the solar industry, we're looking for, you know, sort of state and local level changes to really push the industry and markets forward.
Okay, Robin, before we move on, anything you'd like to add to this?
The thought that just keeps occurring to me is that, you know, a lot of times what hinders some of this innovation is that electricity is too cheap, right? Like, we don't think about, most of us probably on this Zoom, the switchers, are not thinking about the power bill. But for some people, they absolutely are. And we need to keep them in mind. And we need to make things that can be inexpensive as possible. And I think the ITC is a really great, and PTC is a really great example. Like, the tax credit structure makes a ton of sense to get wind that actually produces wind versus their initial derivations. But you know who makes a ton of money on those? Are massive corporations, and there's huge transaction costs, and there's all of these components of it that make that work, that are really quite distant from the people. So I think that what Brian emphasized and what he does sitting in his chair especially is, and what we try and do at the heart of Guzman, is think, how do we take power to the people? And those people include rural communities where $50 a month a difference in a power bill could make a difference in whether or not a kid gets to go to soccer camp, right? And I think that just when we are in a world looking at resilience, which is kind of a SAT word, and talking about, you know, all of these investments, we just need to remember that there's people on the other side of this, and not forget that, which I think is really easy to do. I
think that's a great point. And when Brian was talking about, you know, keeping costs low, I just am reflecting on the challenge of doing even just like electrification, and I think maybe electrification up higher up, Brian, may look different than it does in the Front Range, but you know, if gas is cheap, for example, and you want to advocate for electrification, for decarbonization, that's a hard sell, unless I feel like you can bring some of these other services that can be like controllable load, but you need the programs to support that. So is that something, Brian, I see you took yourself off mute. Is that something that you're, that Holy Cross is working towards?
Yeah, exactly right. I cited our Power Plus energy storage program, which we look forward to opening up to all those that want to participate as partners. And there, we're actually bundling time of use rates with on-bill financing and access to utility low-cost capital for those that don't have the upfront. We're also putting in what we call a distribution flexibility bill credit, which is basically us buying a capacity call on that battery as we might want to use it to help mitigate some of our risks when it comes to exposing ourselves to market prices. We're basically using that battery as a grid resource, and we're giving the consumer a standard monthly credit every month, whether we use it a lot or a little. We're buying the permission to use that as a grid resource and to orchestrate it. And that's what I mean by value stacking. We're sort of stacking all of these different opportunities to get value that normally a consumer would have to spend a lot of time working. And right, the folks that are lowest and moderate income, that are income qualified, are also the ones that are probably working 3 jobs. They're trying to make ends meet. They're taking their kids to school. They're not thinking about how do I stack the values on the battery device that I just bought at wherever. And so I think there's a real role, whether it's in an aggregator or a services provider or a utility itself. I think, but if we want to accelerate the adoption of distributed resources and we want to harvest the resilience value that they inherently provide because they're closer to our consumers, I think there's a real important role for us to play in making that super cheap and super simple for the consumer.
So we're thank you for that, and I want to follow up on it with maybe like one last. We're nearing 7 o'clock. One last round of questions. There's been a number here, like Matthew Lerman just mentioned one about transportation, and I was thinking about the program that, and there was another question I think from David about vehicle to grid. So there's 2 sides of that. One is like, how do you sort of maintain resilience with all of this load coming on? But also, like, Brian, are you going to sort of create a program where you'll buy electric vehicles for your customers if, for $30 a month, like you're doing for stationary batteries? Or is there a model there where you essentially use this as something, the way that you would stationary batteries to your benefit and to sort of provide that additional resilience?
Yeah, we're not there yet on the vehicles themselves, because we see that there's a number of incentives and dealers in our area that are doing things. But we did about 2 years ago focus on the charging infrastructure as a big barrier to why people weren't being comfortable in buying electric vehicles. So we actually give away 2 chargers to every residential member of Holy Cross, 4 chargers to every commercial or industrial member of Holy Cross. We actually give them away for free, and we offer to finance the installation costs. And why do we do the latter? Because when we were just giving away the chargers, we weren't getting them plugged in, and people were like, oh man, but I didn't have the $1,000 to pay the electrician. It's like, okay, look, have the electrician send us the bill. And we do that same thing that we did in the Power Plus program, where we 0% finance, stretch it out over a 36-month window, and it's basically an electric vehicle charging service that a consumer signs up for, and they get the charger as part of the deal. Now, we get to modulate the rate of charging within some pre-set, set parameters, so that we're not adding demand peak and necessitating grid upgrades. That's right. One of the values, the T&D deferral that we get to harvest as part of the deal. I can imagine us doing it for heat pumps. I can imagine it doing it already for fast chargers and school buses and you name it when it comes to electrification. And there'll be more to talk about in future months.
I relate to that. I am still charging on 120 volts because I don't want to pay the $1,000 to install it, and I don't know, my utility is not offering that to me. Chris, is this going to change is vehicle to grid change your business model at all, or do electric vehicles factor in if you're playing the role of an aggregator? Can you bundle more things together like water heaters and you become a different kind of company, or is that out of your focus?
It's probably above my pay grade, but yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, once you have I think the battery is really the key right there. It's got the software, and if it can communicate with your with all of your appliances, with your vehicle, then it's probably easy to do. And so I can imagine lots of solar and storage installers wanting to get into those different markets. I think it really makes a lot of sense. It increases the value proposition of the distributed energy resources at a customer's site.
Yeah, and Robin, and maybe this is the last word since we're nearing the hour, but does this make do electric vehicles make your contracting or the services you provide any easier? Does it change the way that you can hedge risk or anything like that because there's more controllable load out there?
Yeah, I think that it's more, electrons consumed is good from a wholesale provider perspective. So we are in favor of it. The control component of it fits a little bit more neatly in the distribution utility space and figuring out where to put it. One last comment, which is I had a great call with a innovative, retail choice provider in Europe. And he had been incubating a program with a major car company because car companies are concerned that utilities could build EVs easier than they could become the utilities to supply. So I think that the level of competitive forces that come into this space of electrification is much bigger than we necessarily know. And going back to Brian's theory of like stacking value chain, EVs become a tool in that toolkit if they're controlled and there's information that come into it. If they're just like randomly charged wherever without information, they can become a real challenge to the utilities.
Yeah. So I think I have one more question, Sam, if that's okay, unless you want to close it. You're muted. You're muted.
She's saying yes. Go for it.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, thanks. So yeah, I mean, I think we sort of tend to sort of talk about positives, things that we're doing well. Like if you were going to sort of give one word of caution to whether it's like the Texas or California grids or other rural co-ops or any utilities out there, some sort of piece of advice about how we're going to get this wrong in the coming year, and we're going to sort of like say, we should have had more foresight, or we should have like done X better. What advice would you give to them? Robin, you want to start?
Sure. I feel like I'm belying my philosophy background, but I think that we just need to realize we're all in it together, right? So I think if we do it incorrectly, we will have haves and have-nots. We will have Tesla charging with solar power and battery packs, or in DC you saw literally like people with, gas generators that could turn on if there was an outage. And I think that we need to think of it in a community-minded approach, and we need to shave costs where we can, because we have other significant investments that we need to make in order to be able to realize this future of 100% renewable and 100% power on for our children and grandchildren.
So every utility should be a co-op. That was for Brian's benefit.
That's a whole other economic question.
Chris?
Yeah, I think I'd probably agree with Robin's earlier comment where she said we need, high voltage transmission lines, and we need DERs. We need all of the options right now. This is a multi-trillion-dollar problem that we have to deal with, and we should not at this point be leaving anything off of the table. We need the whole suite of options right now.
Great. Brian?
Josh, I'll just say that resilience is a moving target. Whether it's a changing climate, whether it's emerging threat vectors on the cybersecurity front, whether it's new equipment that fails in creative ways, you can't just design for today and think that you're going to be covered. You have to actually design for tomorrow, or like I say, take your worst day and then multiply it times 10 and think of all the things that could go wrong, and then try and imagine everything that you've missed, and then figure out what your plan is.
Great. Sam, I think I've tried to sort of, and I mean, for everyone still on, capture all of your questions as best we can. There were some good ones in there. There's a lot we probably didn't cover or get to, like cybersecurity, undergrounding transition lines. I mean, this topic obviously goes on and on, but it was really, I thought, really insightful to hear from all three of you, and appreciate the context and the specific work that you're doing. So from my perspective, thanks so much. And Sam, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I would just like to iterate on that again. I thought it was an awesome conversation, and I would like to give a specific call out to Josh. Resilience is a complicated issue, as Robin mentioned. It's a systems issue, and we pulled 3 experts from very different roles into a conversation that I think you moderated beautifully. So thank you so much to you and to all the panelists for making a really easy to understand conversation around a very difficult topic. And even though we didn't get to all the questions we had, we do still have a networking event right after this. I am posting the link to that event in the chat box right now. It is on a different platform. Please be patient. We will jump on there and broadcast the instructions for how to use it once we get there. And that is also where we're going to be giving away the Amazon Echo 5. But just again, thank you all so much. I really appreciate the conversation today, and we're looking forward to the networking afterwards as well.
Yay, Switch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Switchers.
Bye-bye.